As some Republicans in Congress continue to downplay the severity of the deadly attack on the Capitol, we're getting an even closer look at just how violent things got on January 6th. Body camera video newly obtained by CNN shows D.C. Metro Police Officer Michael Fanone under siege from rioters and pleading for his life. This is just the latest video depicting the attack. In the immediate aftermath, we saw other officers getting crushed by rioters, getting dragged down the Capitol stairs and beaten with a flag, along with images of people who look ready for battle, carrying weapons and zip-tie handcuffs. But in the face of all that, Georgia Congressman Andrew Clyde said this during a House Oversight Committee hearing yesterday.
There was no insurrection, and to call it an insurrection, in my opinion, is a bold-faced lie. Watching the TV footage of those who entered the Capitol and walked through Statuary Hall showed people in an orderly fashion staying between the stanchions and ropes taking videos and pictures. You know, if you didn't know the TV footage was a video from January the 6th, you would actually think it was a normal tourist visit.
A remarkable denial of reality. That hearing came just hours after House Republicans voted to oust Wyoming Congresswoman Liz Cheney, a vocal critic of former President Donald Trump, who voted for his impeachment earlier this year from her leadership position. That's a move the House Minority Leader has been trying to separate from the election lies that fueled the January 6th attack.
I don't think anybody is questioning the legitimacy of the presidential election.
This has nothing to do about how somebody voted. This has nothing to do about they voted for impeachment or not. That would have been decided the last time. This is simply who's best at delivering the message. That's all.
But in a speech ahead of the vote, Cheney reiterated some of her many criticisms of Trump, which center around his ongoing refusal to accept the results of the 2020 election.
A former president who provoked a violent attack on this Capitol in an effort to steal the election has resumed his aggressive effort to convince Americans that the election was stolen from him. Remaining silent and ignoring the lie emboldens the liar. I will not participate in that.
According to the House Minority Leader, those words run counter to the message of the GOP. So what does all this mean for the future of the party and of the country as a whole? I'm joined by the new author of the Politico Massachusetts Playbook, Liz Cheney, and Tom Nichols, a former member of the GOP and the author of Our Own Worst Enemy, The Assault from Within on Modern Democracy. Thank you both for being here.
Thank you for having me.
And Lisa, before we get started, congratulations on the new job, which is a great one.
Thank you very much. I'm very excited about it.
Tom, I'll start with you. Are you surprised at the way the removal of Liz Cheney from leadership went down? Not that it happened, but that it happened as quickly as it did and as forcefully as it did?
No, and I wish I could say that I were, but this has been an inevitable collision between Liz Cheney and a few other handful of Republicans like Adam Kinzinger for a while now. And I think in the end, there are two things going on. One is with the Republican Party as an institution, and one is with individual Republicans. And I think the party as an institution just doesn't want to keep being reminded of the terrible things that have happened over the past 4 years. But they also have to keep swearing their loyalty to Donald Trump. And that's in the interest of a lot of individual Republican members who like being in Congress and want to stay there. So, you know, you couldn't have a member of your leadership being the ghost of Christmas past and reminding you of all the terrible things that had just happened just 3 or 4 months ago.
You mentioned Adam Kinzinger as another Republican member of Congress who has taken positions similar to the ones that Liz Cheney has taken when it comes to what happened last fall, and this winter. Besides Kinzinger, who else is there in a, I don't know if never Trump is the right term, the critical of Trump caucus that still exists in the House GOP?
You know, I knew you were going to ask me that, and I was kind of racking my brain to think beyond Cheney and Kinzinger. In the Senate, Mitt Romney. But, you know, at this point, you could hold that meeting in, you know, not even in a phone booth. I mean, in one booth of a diner. And that tells you where the institutional Republican Party has gone. This is the new Republican Party.
So all the talk that we heard on the heels of January 6th about a reckoning in store for the party nationally speaking, as far as you're concerned, the reckoning is over and done with, right?
Yeah, I was one of the people arguing even a few years ago that the Republican Party is just, as it once existed, is over and has to be voted out down to the submolecular level in politics, because this capture has gone all the way from the Senate all the way down to local and state parties, and it's complete.
The reckoning may be complete nationally and at the state level, but it is not, I think, entirely here in Massachusetts, which I want to talk to you about, Lisa. Before I do, let's take a look at what Charlie Baker, the governor of Massachusetts, had to say when he was asked about Liz Cheney's situation.
I made very clear that I felt the election process that took place back in November was fair, and that President Joe Biden won the election. And on those issues, I believe Liz Cheney is absolutely right.
So, Lisa, it's fair to say those comments were not a surprise, right, coming from Charlie Baker?
Yeah, this is what you would expect Governor Charlie Baker to say. I mean, remember, this is a Republican governor who, who wouldn't vote for Trump, who blanked his ballot in 2020, and who wasn't afraid to criticize, then President Trump over everything from the coronavirus pandemic, how he was handling it, to, his actions after the election and after the, after the Capitol attack. So yes, this is very much in line with what you would expect Charlie Baker to say, kind of towing that more moderate Republican line.
And yet, it's another example of how Governor Baker on the one hand and the state Republican Party, which has gone in a very different direction, how much of a chasm there is separating them as we look ahead to Baker possibly running for a third term in 2022. Do you think it's going to make it more likely, those comments yesterday, coming on the heels of everything else that you've talked about, more likely that he gets a primary challenge from the right?
I think that's something that's been building, and I think it's something that you might already see happening. You have Jeff Deal, the Republican who challenged Elizabeth Warren in 2018. He is already laying the groundwork for a potential run in 2022 for governor, whether that is, to the right, a primary challenge to Governor Charlie Baker or Lieutenant Governor Karen Polito, or just running on his own. You're already seeing that groundwork there, and you're already seeing him have the support of some in the Mass GOP leadership, as you talked about those kind of factions within the Republican Party. So I think the door is definitely open to that, but how successful it is, remains to be seen in a state that there's a small number of real registered Republicans.
I want to come back to that. You're going to get the last word on that question, but you may be one of the only people I've ever actually talked to face who, like me, checks out the social media feeds of the Mass Republican Party. I was looking the other day, they were cheering on the lawsuit questioning Baker's use of emergency powers to manage COVID. And then there was a post praising Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, saying something along the lines of, here's what real Republican leadership looks like. And it was just remarkable. Baker, of course, as you both know and our viewers know, is wildly popular in Massachusetts. It's such a strange thing to watch.
I'm a former Massachusetts Republican. I grew up in the Commonwealth, and that's when I joined the Republican Party back in the late 70s. But you can't form a party on, me and Charlie Baker. And I'm not even sure what it means to be a Massachusetts Republican for somebody like Baker anymore. At this point, Baker is carrying a party label from a bygone time, and his positions are, I would argue, it's difficult to distinguish Baker's positions from that of a centrist Democrat or of a liberal Republican. And there are no liberal Republicans left. And so I think, Baker, I don't think it does the governor much good to change his party registration. That just kind of annoys people in both parties. But Charlie Baker, and to some lesser extent, somebody like Larry Hogan in Maryland, they're really unique cases. They are the exceptions that prove the rule. And even within his own state, his own Republican Party is determined to hunt the last Charlie Bakers to extinction and drive them out of politics. And so, I think that actually makes the case that the Republican Party really has been captured by its lunatic fringe, because they can't even coalesce behind a governor like Charlie Baker.
Tom, I know you wrote a book about this, basically, but I want to ask you for a brevia of why it is that the fealty toward Donald Trump on the national level across the GOP remains as intense as it does. He's a one-term president, lost the popular vote 2 times, lost it the second time, and lost the presidency. I think in large part because he seemed just not that interested in a hopefully once-in-a-generation pandemic that was killing hundreds of thousands of people in the country. Why hasn't the hold that he had on the GOP lifted in the subsequent months?
A huge amount of it's still being driven by spite. There are people within the GOP, and I think even some of those voters who wish that Trump would just get on a slow boat to Antarctica and vanish, but he's not going to do that. And they can't climb down and admit how wrong they were about Trump. They refuse to believe it. And the thing I wrote about is that in part, this is because our politics have, and especially the politics of the resentful right, have become overwhelmed by narcissism and by this complete inability to ever admit a mistake, an inability to understand that, that you got conned. Trump, in a narcissistic country, in a narcissistic age, Donald Trump was the most obvious choice for president because he's the most narcissistic person that's ever walked into the Oval Office, and that's probably saying something. So those folks are not going to climb down. I think this is one of the things that a lot of people expected. So when the election's over, the Republicans are fever's going to break.
That was Joe Biden's theory, right?
Right. Well, and others like Jeb Bush and other prominent Republicans, as well as Joe Biden, that, this will all end. This is not going to end. People have fused this vote they made in 2016 and 2020 to their sense of themselves in a very tribal way, and they're just not going to let it go. And that's to go back to your initial question, Adam, about the immense level of lying from people like this congressman in Georgia. They are not going to admit the reality of what they created and what they voted for. And so they're just going to keep staying with it and say, this didn't happen. I was right. Everything's fine. And that you can't form a party on that. You can't sustain a party on that.
Lisa, I want to give you the last word here on local matters and ask you a similar question to the one I just ran by Tom. As you mentioned earlier in the conversation, Joe Biden beat Donald Trump here something like 2-1, maybe exactly 2-1. Do you have a theory about why the mass Republican Party has gone all in on Trumpism, despite the fact that from the outside, it really doesn't look like a recipe for electoral success?
Yeah, you're exactly right. There were candidates that ran for federal office, for state office in Massachusetts, Republicans for 2020 who leaned into Trumpism and lost badly. But right now, instead of, as we kind of talked about, instead of that soul searching, in the Republican Party after the election and after the Capitol attack, you have this retrenchment. And people are, as you said, holding fast to these ideals. And I think that that's very much going on with the factions of the Massachusetts Republican Party right now, where you have, the chairman, Jim Lyons continuing to lean in to that Trumpism, the radical left, the socialism, because he really thinks that is what will recruit new members who are maybe sick of the Democrats, and he is willing to keep trying that. And I think that 2022, in his mind, is the real test of whether that's going to work.
All right. On that note, Lisa Kashinsky, Tom Nichols, thank you both for being here for this convo.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.